The dive began as a clean checklist. I moved through each step with the steady rhythm I had built over years underwater. Every cable, latch, and pressure seal was touched twice. The team trusted me with the scanner systems, so I kept my focus sharp. The surface crew lowered the submersible into the water while the waves slapped against the hull in slow patterns. The shift from daylight into deep blue always felt like crossing a border. This time, there was a heavier weight in the water even before we dropped past the first 100 meters. Inside the cabin, the lights dimmed to their usual soft glow. I ran initial scans and compared the readings against last week's models. Something in the numbers felt wrong. The rift zone had always been quiet, but the seismic pulses today were spaced in a strange rhythm, not strong enough to be dangerous, yet steady enough to make me stare at the screen longer than usual. I flagged the pattern for later and kept descending. The others were in their own worlds. The pilot leaned forward with his hands tight on the controls. The commander watched our oxygen cycle with sharp eyes. No one spoke unless they needed to. There was a tension that didn't belong to the crew. It belonged to the water. The deeper we went, the more the pressure wrapped around us like a tightening sleeve. Around 800 meters, the first tremor hit. A soft jolt ran through the submersible. It wasn't enough to knock anything loose, but it made the metal ribs hum for a second. I checked the scanner again. The pulse that followed the tremor didn't match the direction of the quake. It came from below us, not from the fault line. A single spike rose in the readings and then went flat. The pilot looked at me for confirmation. I didn't have an answer ready. I only told him to maintain descent speed and stay aligned with the beacon. The commander asked if the readings were safe. I said yes, even though the pattern didn't look like any geological shift I had seen. I kept my doubts to myself. This dive was too important for hesitation. Funding depended on bringing back something useful. We passed the 1,000-meter mark. Darkness swallowed the windows until only the submersible lights cut through the black water. Tiny organisms drifted past in slow trails, glowing in faint specks. They moved in waves, almost like they were reacting to something distant. Another tremor moved through the hull. This one was softer, almost like a breath moving across metal. I adjusted the gain on the scanner. The readings showed dips and rises that felt deliberate. The pattern repeated 3 times before fatting. I saved the data and leaned closer to the screen. Something about the spacing reminded me of biological signals. Not identical, but close enough to make my stomach tighten. The commander asked for a status check. I kept my voice steady as I reported nominal conditions. The pilot maintained our descent path toward the unknown section of the rift. The thermal readings dropped faster than expected. Cold crept through the walls and settled into the metal. The pressure gauge ticked upward in slow increments. At 1,400 meters, the water shifted. A wide cloud of sediment drifted up from below like something had swept across the seafloor. The pilot slowed the descent. I turned the lights to their widest spread. The cloud began to clear, revealing the edge of a fresh fracture. The rock looked split open, sharp and raw. It stretched far beyond our lights, disappearing into the dark. The tremors stopped. The water settled into a quiet stillness. It was the kind of stillness that never meant calm. It meant waiting. I zoomed the scanner toward the fracture. The pitch of the return signal wasn't correct. It came back hollow, not solid. There was a chamber under us, a large one, bigger than anything marked on our maps. I felt a slow pulse rise through the hull. It wasn't a quake. It felt like movement. The commander asked if we should pull back. The pilot glanced at me again. The scanner showed patterns rising in faint arches and curves, shapes that shouldn't exist in rock, shapes that suggested structure. I logged the readings and told the pilot to continue. Curiosity was a thin blade, but once it cut, there was no turning it dull again. We drifted closer to the fracture, lights sweeping over jagged edges and swirling silt. The ocean pressed harder around us as if reacting to our presence. I felt my heartbeat slow into the rhythm of the scanner pulses, not matching them but echoing them. Something was waiting below the fracture, something hidden under layers of cold and pressure. And as we hovered at the edge of that crack in the earth, the last tremor of the descent shuddered upward through the hull. It didn't feel like the ground shifting. It felt like something breathing from underneath. The fracture stretched beneath us like a fresh wound in the planet. Sharp angles of rock jutted into the water, each one coated in drifting silt. The pilot nudged the thrusters to keep us steady, but the current pulled us subtly toward the opening. I tightened the stabilizers and recalibrated the scanner so it could penetrate the sediment cloud. The returning signal was distorted. It came back uneven, like it was bouncing off surfaces that weren't solid rock. A low vibration moved through the hull. It made the metal frame hum for a moment. The pilot glanced at me, waiting for the explanation I didn't have. I checked the pressure gauge to be safe. Everything looked normal. The strange part was the absence of any strong quake readings. The tremor we felt didn't show on the scale. The seafloor had moved, but the instruments weren't calling it seismic activity. That unsettled me more than any spike. The commander ordered us forward. We crept along the edge of the fracture at a pace that felt painfully slow. Our lights skimmed across surfaces that were too smooth for broken rock. Some sections looked polished. Others curved inward like something had pushed from behind. I kept saving the footage for analysis. Every few seconds the scanner flickered with small bursts of static. The interference didn't look random. It pulsed. When the sediment thinned, the full shape of the new opening came into view. It ran across the seabed in a long split, almost symmetrical. The pilot steadied the submersible and held position. None of us said a word. A soft trail of marine snow drifted between us and the fracture. The water felt colder here. It wasn't the kind of cold that came from pressure or depth. It felt like the temperature was being pulled out of the water rather than sinking naturally. I switched to thermal imaging. The screen lit with two distinct colors. The rock around the fracture showed normal readings. The hollow beneath it showed mild warmth. That warmth was moving, slowly but steadily. The commander leaned over my shoulder to look. He didn't say anything, but the tension in his jaw made his thoughts clear. Something was active under the seafloor. I activated the probe arm to collect a sample from the fracture's edge. The metal claw closed around a chunk of loose rock and lifted it into the container. The rock felt lighter than expected. When I scanned it, the density was lower than normal basalt. It had hollow pockets inside, like small tunnels or veins. The pattern didn't match any mineral structure I recognized. The commander suggested it might be a new volcanic type. I knew he didn't believe that. Neither did I. The pilot shifted our angle so we could inspect the deeper section of the fracture. That was when the second tremor hit. It wasn't violent. It felt like a hand pushing us gently from below. The submersible drifted off the stable line. The pilot corrected quickly, but the movement left a heavy silence in the cabin. The scanner pulsed again. The return signal built into a curve that rose and dipped in perfect timing. The pattern repeated twice. It wasn't seismic. It wasn't random. It was structured. I checked the readings again. The hollow beneath us wasn't empty. It was layered. Something inside was moving in slow intervals. A deep shape sat beneath the rock, large enough to distort the signal into wide arcs. I adjusted the angle, hoping it was just a cluster of boulders. It was. The arcs had symmetry, smooth, continuous symmetry. The pilot asked if we were still safe. I didn't respond right away. I needed a few seconds to convince myself before I could convince him. I told them both that we could continue, but we needed to keep a stricter distance from the fracture. I didn't want us drifting into the hollow by accident. The commander approved. He wanted footage. Evidence meant funding and recognition. Fear didn't slow him down. It rarely did. The pilot didn't argue. He never argued when the commander was in that tone. We moved closer, only a few meters deeper into the new canyon. The lights reached farther now. The smooth surfaces inside the fracture reflected the beam in faint curves. The deeper we looked, the more unnatural it became. These curves bent inward. They were repeating structures. Nothing in geology looked like that. My hands tightened on the controls. The scanner flickered again and then resolved into a new shape, a long arc, then another below it, then a third. 3 perfect curves stacked on top of each other inside the hollow. The pilot swallowed hard. The commander leaned back, confused. I zoomed in on the scan. The arcs mirrored each other with absolute accuracy, the kind of symmetry nature almost never creates. The water shuddered again. A faint burst of silt rose from the bottom of the fracture, not from pressure, from movement. We finally had a choice to make. The safe choice was to turn back, record what we could, detach from the zone and return to the surface with our equipment intact. The real choice was to go deeper. Curiosity won before anyone said a word. It moved through the cabin like a silent current. The pilot adjusted the thrusters. The commander nodded. I locked the scanner to a narrower beam. We went forward. None of us understood then how close we already were, how thin the layer of rock was between us and something that had been buried longer than our species existed. We only understood the first part. This fracture was not a break in the seafloor. It was the beginning of an opening. The fracture narrowed as we moved deeper along its spine. Our lights carved thin paths through the dark water, revealing only pieces of the terrain at a time. I kept my eyes locked on the scanner. The arcs were still there, adjusting slightly every few seconds. The pattern wasn't drifting the way rock formations usually do when the submersible changes angle. It was shifting on its own. A faint vibration tapped through the hull. At first it felt like distant gravel falling down a slope. Then it repeated, same spacing, same rhythm. The pilot paused the thrusters and listened. Another tap moved through the metal, then 2 more in quick succession. The commander asked if it was coming from the seafloor. I didn't answer right away. I needed the scanner to confirm what my nerves already suspected. When the return wave stabilized, it showed a low-frequency pulse coming from the hollow beneath the fracture. Each pulse matched the timing of the tapping we felt. The sound wasn't geological. It wasn't caused by settling rock or distant shifting plates. It was deliberate. I zoomed the scanner into a narrower range. The pulse pattern sharpened into alternating peaks that looked almost like a heartbeat stretched across the screen. It rose and fell in steady intervals. Too steady for chance. Too steady for nature's randomness. The commander leaned closer. His breath tightened when he saw the pattern repeat with mechanical precision. The pilot whispered a question about turning back. He said it softly, almost like he didn't want the water around us to hear it. The commander rejected the idea immediately. His voice was steady, but I could see the thin tension in his jaw. He wasn't immune to fear. He just refused to let fear outrank ambition. Another tap moved through the hull, this one stronger. It rattled a loose tool against the floor. The pilot cursed under his breath and adjusted the stabilizers so the submersible wouldn't drift. The tapping stopped as soon as he touched the controls. The water felt still again, but the stillness didn't feel empty. It felt like something was waiting. The scanner flickered again. Thin lines appeared along the arcs, connecting them in branching segments. The shape began to resemble something with structure. I zoomed further until the screen could barely process the detail. The arcs weren't random curves. They were layered surfaces. Broad ones, smooth ones, slightly concave. The commander asked me to save the frame. I did, but my mind stayed stuck on the shape. It looked like a massive inner surface, too symmetrical to be natural, too large to belong to any known organism. For a moment I wondered if we were scanning fossilized remains trapped under the crust. That possibility felt safer. It felt logical, but fossils don't tap. Fossils don't pulse. We moved another few meters forward. Silt drifted around the windows in gentle spirals. The water pressure climbed. A faint groan echoed from somewhere in the trench, vibrating the submersible's outer shell. It was deep and drawn out, like the ocean itself was adjusting to a new shape. The pilot stiffened and pulled his hands away from the controls. He said the sub shifted without him touching anything. I checked the orientation. He was right. A small horizontal tilt had happened on its own. The current didn't cause it. There was no current here. The scanner locked onto a new pulse, this one stronger. It traveled upward through the rock, hit the bottom of the sub, and spread across the cabin floor. I felt it in my legs, a slow rise, a slow fall. A second pulse followed, then a third. The pattern wasn't random. It was communication. I didn't want to say the word out loud. Neither did the pilot. The commander didn't care about the label. He only cared about confirming the source. He told me to run a depth penetration sweep. It was the one command I didn't want to follow, because the sweep would reveal exactly how close we were to whatever was beneath us. But I started the sweep. The scanner released a concentrated beam into the fracture. The returning signal took longer than expected, as if the beam had been absorbed before bouncing back. When it finally returned, the shape was bigger than anything the three of us imagined. A massive curved structure extended deeper into the rock layers, smooth and continuous. Not a boulder. Not a cavern. Not geology. Something living. The pilot muttered a prayer. The commander didn't react. I felt my spine tighten as the shape expanded on the screen. The sweep showed the structure rising and falling in sync with the pulses. The movements were slow but intentional. The entire mass beneath us was shifting with a rhythm like a giant chamber contracting and expanding. Breathing. We hovered in silence. The scanner's glow flickered across all our faces. The truth sat inside that flicker, heavy and undeniable. The fracture wasn't just revealing part of the seafloor. It was revealing something that had been buried under it. And whatever it was, it had begun to wake. The next tremor didn't feel like the earlier ones. This one struck in a single sharp jolt that threw the submersible upward before slamming it back into place. Tools rattled against the floor. A storage latch snapped open and spilled a row of sealed tubes across the cabin. The pilot gripped the controls so tightly his knuckles turned pale. The commander braced himself against the wall and demanded a damage report. I scanned every system as fast as my hands could move. Nothing was broken, nothing was leaking, but the water around us had changed. The pressure wasn't rising in a smooth curve the way it should during deep dives. It spiked in small bursts like invisible waves were pushing against the sub. The scanner lit with new interference. Lines streaked across the screen, then bent inward, forming curves that matched the shape we had seen earlier. The pulses were stronger now, faster, urgent. The pilot steadied us and tilted the sub so the lights reached deeper into the fracture. The silt below erupted in a massive cloud that rose like smoke from a collapsing building. The water churned in heavy spirals. When the cloud finally thinned, all three of us froze. The fracture wasn't a narrow opening anymore. It had torn itself into a huge chasm, dozens of meters across. The entire seafloor had shifted. It looked as if a massive body under the crust had pressed upward with enough force to break its own ceiling. I focused the lights on the nearest exposed surface. Smooth ridges curled upward from the new tier. They weren't rock layers. They weren't sediment lines. They looked like structural folds, thick ones, layered ones. The color wasn't the gray of stone. It had a faint organic sheen. The pilot whispered that the surface looked like cartilage. The commander told him to stay focused, but even he didn't sound convinced by his own tone. I adjusted the beam angle to catch more detail. The surface dipped inward in repetitive arcs. Each arc curved with too much precision. These patterns weren't random or eroded. They were shaped. A deep vibration rose through the hull. It wasn't sharp like a quake. It felt heavy, slow, alive. The metal floor trembled beneath our feet. Loose tubes rolled toward the back of the cabin. The pilot gripped the console to stay balanced. The scanner spikes shot upward in perfect timing with the vibration. The internal monitor flashed warning after warning about unstable terrain. The commander asked me if we were experiencing another plate shift. I told him the truth. The scanner wasn't detecting tectonic compression, it was detecting displacement. Something underneath, the seafloor was moving its own weight. The pilot asked if we should retreat. The commander asked for more detail before making a decision. I zoomed the scanner deeper. The beam cut through the hollow beneath us and returned with a new shape that hadn't been visible before. A long, continuous line curved across the entire reading. Then another appeared below it. Then a third above it. These lines were not geological faults. They were edges. Broad, smooth, symmetrical edges. And each one was moving in small, slow intervals. The water around the fracture suddenly surged upward. A heavy pocket of trapped sediment burst out, shooting toward the surface like smoke pushed through a vent. The sub lurched sideways. The pilot hit the stabilizers just as the hull began to tilt forward. I grabbed the nearest strap and locked myself in place. The lights swept across the newly exposed surface again. This time, the shifting silt revealed something that made the air leave my lungs. The curved surface wasn't just a structure. It was part of a massive shape embedded in the rock. A shape with repeating ridges that formed a wide arc. A shape beginning to separate along a long central line. That line stretched wider. Dirt and silt peeled away from it in a slow fall. The opening deepened by a few centimeters. It wasn't much, but it was enough to reveal a dark interior beneath the layers. The commander stepped closer to the window. His breath caught for a moment before he pushed himself back into control. The pilot whispered a question he already knew the answer to. I didn't want to confirm it. I didn't want to turn the suspicion into a truth. But the scanner didn't lie. The movement didn't lie. The shape didn't lie. The seafloor was not cracking open. It was pulling open. And we were watching the beginning of that opening. Another vibration moved through the sub, stronger than before. The reading on the scanner rose in a steady wave that matched something deep beneath us, something lifting, something breathing. The commander ordered us to descend closer to the exposed structure for clearer footage. He wanted confirmation, proof, evidence that no one could dispute. The pilot hesitated for 3 seconds. Then he followed the order. We sank toward the widening chasm. And as we approached the curved structure emerging from the crust, the subtle tremors in the water changed tone. They shifted into a heavy, rhythmic pattern. The pattern of something alive, waking from a very long sleep. The deeper we descended, the clearer the shape became. Our lights swept across the exposed surface and revealed details that made every instinct in me tighten. The structure wasn't rock. It wasn't fossilized bone. The outer layer had a faint sheen, the kind that only living tissue carries under enough pressure to harden. Thick folds curved in patterns too deliberate to be anything natural. Each ridge sloped downward like layered armor. The size of it was beyond scale. Even with full lights, we could only see a small portion at a time. The pilot slowed us to a crawl. The submersible drifted just above the curved surface. I stared at it through the reinforced glass, trying to understand what part of a creature this could be. The scanner pulsed again. The return wave formed a perfect arc spanning across the entire screen. It matched the curvature beneath us. A second arc appeared beneath the first, then a third, each one aligned with absolute precision. The commander asked for a structural reading. I scanned the surface with narrow-frequency beams. The results made my chest tighten. The layers were dense, flexible and porous in a pattern similar to biological cartilage. The depth readings showed that the structure extended far beneath the crust, far deeper than any living organism should reach. The measurement kept extending until the scanner could no longer calculate. The structure was too large for the system to quantify. A sudden vibration rippled through the water, not a sharp tremor, a deep pulse. It moved across the curved surface, causing faint ripples to travel along the ridges. The pilot backed the sub away instinctively. The commander warned him to hold position, but the pilot refused. He said the pulse didn't feel like movement in the ground. It felt like something reacting to us. I ran another scan. The pulse repeated, rising through the crust with slow force. The intervals matched a biological pattern, a pattern of sustained internal pressure shifting through a living chamber. Something enormous beneath us was contracting. The pilot's voice shook when he said the surface looked like it was breathing. I wanted to deny it, but the scanner data mirrored his fear. The rhythm was too precise, too consistent, too alive. We held our position a few meters above the structure. I magnified the camera feed to study the outer layer. Thin grooves lined the ridges in branching paths. Each path split and rejoined in perfect symmetry. The grooves weren't random erosion. They were channels. They carried something, a fluid, a signal, a function. The commander ordered me to zoom further. I focused on one groove. Beneath the silt, the channel had a translucent quality. Something faint moved inside it, slow pulses, like circulation. Another vibration traveled through the surface, this one stronger. The curved structure flexed inward by a few millimeters. It was subtle but noticeable. Loose silt slid across the folds. The shape beneath us shifted again, sending a low rumble across the fracture walls. The pilot whispered that we needed to leave. The commander reminded him that we were here to collect evidence, not run from anomalies. The pilot began arguing. His breathing grew fast. He said no geological structure in the world behaves like this. He said no research was worth being crushed under something that moved like a living organism. Their argument faded when the next shift happened. The structure retracted. Not the trembling of rock, not the settling of crust. A controlled movement. It pulled inward with slow force. Layers of silt cascaded off its surface like dust falling from an opening door. A faint pocket of water rushed into the gap left behind. I zoomed the camera instinctively. The retraction exposed a deeper layer beneath the outer folds. This layer was darker, thicker, and formed a long curved line. A line shaped like the top of a lip. The pilot stiffened. The commander leaned forward. I scanned again. The returning image expanded until it showed what we were trying not to see. Another curved ridge, parallel, smooth, nearly identical. Two arcs perfectly aligned. The shape between them dipped inward into a shadowed seam. A seam beginning to widen. The structure wasn't just part of a body. It was a mouth. A massive one buried beneath the crust. The water vibrated again. A slow exhale of pressure escaped the opening. Small organisms drifted toward it as if pulled by a gentle current. The gap widened by another few centimeters, enough for darkness to spill outward like ink. The pilot tried to nudge the sub back without orders. The commander told him to stop. Their voices overlapped, fear mixed with command. I didn't intervene. I couldn't. Because the scanner pulsed one more time. This pulse didn't reflect random movement. It matched the shape of the opening. The pattern formed one clear reading. The mouth was starting to open. The fracture widened in a slow, steady drag. It didn't break the way rock breaks. It stretched. Layers of silt peeled back in long ribbons as the curved ridges pulled apart. Our lights hit the widening seam, revealing a deep fissure lined with darker tissue beneath the hardened outer folds. The pilot locked his hands on the controls. The commander gripped the rail beside him. I watched the scanner pulse in a rhythm that matched the motion of the opening. Water flowed inward, not violently but with a steady pull as if something behind the opening was drawing in a long, measured breath. The current tugged at the submersible. The pilot compensated, but the drift was noticeable. The pressure gauge flickered. The temperature around us shifted by a fraction of a degree. Every change was small, but every one of them came from the same source. The opening was alive. Our lights pushed deeper inside the forming gap. It wasn't a cavern. It wasn't a collapsed chamber. The interior walls were layered with thick, smooth ridges in parallel patterns. They glistened beneath the beams, coated in a faint film of organic sheen. Long strands of sediment drifted toward the darkness like dust pulled toward a vent. The deeper layers of the structure began to show subtle, rhythmic motion, tiny contractions, almost invisible but real. The pilot whispered something without realizing he said it. His voice cracked. The commander ordered him to steady the sub. The suction pressure was rising. Instruments began to blink warning lights, not because the sub was failing, but because the water density near the opening was shifting. The change showed a gradient that suggested a large internal cavity was adjusting its pressure. A cavity large enough to inhale the surrounding water. The scanner pulsed again. The returning signal was sharper this time. The reading mapped the interior shape of the opening. The structure formed a long vertical slit that expanded and contracted in slow movements. I watched the lines rise and fall across the screen. They looked like the start of deep internal chambers connecting behind the opening. The pilot pulled the sub back another meter. The current tugged harder. Loose debris outside drifted toward the seam and vanished into the darkness. A length of dead kelp wrapped around the side of the sub, tugged in the direction of the opening. The pilot cut the maneuvering thrusters for a moment to avoid overcorrecting. The sub drifted sideways before he could stabilize it. That's when the opening moved. Not the slow stretching from before. A sharp contraction, a shift in the interior tissue. A rolling motion passed along the inner ridges, causing them to flex and push outward. A burst of trapped silt shot out from the seam like something inside had expelled air or displaced a pocket of sediment. The water was cloudy for a moment. When it cleared, the seam had widened by almost half a meter. The commander swore under his breath. The pilot demanded permission to retreat. The commander didn't answer immediately. His eyes were locked on the view outside. Mine were locked on the scanner. The readings were no longer showing slow pulses. They were showing increasing curvature. The arcs were rising. The shape of the mouth was expanding. The next pulse came not through the scanner but through the hull itself. A deep vibration rolled across the metal floor. It felt like a distant boom, muffled by layers of earth and water. The sound didn't come from behind us or above us. It came from inside the opening. The interior walls shifted again. The contraction rolled deeper into the structure. The darkness inside flickered with faint bioluminescent glows, not bright enough to illuminate anything, but visible enough to confirm there was movement deeper inside. Then the suction intensified. Small gravel and loose rock along the fracture slid toward the opening. Light marine snow accelerated toward the seam. The water around us shifted in a clear direction. It wasn't chaotic like a violent current. It was controlled. The pressure inside the opening was drawing the environment inward with purpose. The pilot fought the controls. The sub tilted dangerously toward the seam. I grabbed the stabilizer lever and assisted. The hull creaked as the current pulled at the metal plates. The commander barked an order to increase reverse thrust. The pilot hit the switch. The thrusters roared, but the movement was slow. Too slow. The scanner spiked. The opening expanded again. The interior ridges flexed outward like thick, organic gates. A deeper space behind them came into view, coated in darker folds. The radius of the opening grew wider than the sub's entire front section. A low-pressure shockwave pushed through the water. It wasn't violent, but strong enough to rattle everything bolted inside the cabin. The shockwave carried an internal vibration. The frequency was too low to hear as sound, but every bone in my body felt it. It spread through the sub like a slow hum. The commander grabbed my shoulder hard enough to anchor himself. The pilot stabilized the tilt, but the water kept pulling us closer to the widening mouth. The structure wasn't just opening. It was waking, and it was beginning to breathe in. The pull of the current grew stronger in slow, deliberate increments. It wasn't the chaotic suction of a collapsing cave. It was a steady inhaling force, measured and rhythmic. The sub tilted forward again, nose drifting toward the opening. The pilot fought the controls. Sweat rolled down his temple even in the cold cabin. The commander locked his stance beside him, ready to take over if the tilt worsened. I kept my eyes on the scanner as the arcs grew sharper, taller, and more defined. The water density shifted again. The gradient formed a sloping curve that confirmed what we were afraid to say out loud. The cavity inside the opening was expanding and contracting with a biological rhythm, not a single shallow motion, a deep one, wide enough for the pressure to spread across the fracture and pull everything nearby toward it. The suction caught a net of drifting plant material and dragged it into the darkness. A cluster of small fish followed, disappearing in a quick flutter of tails. Loose rock fragments skimmed across the seafloor and vanished inside the widening seam. The pilot cursed under his breath. He cut the thrust for 1 second to avoid blowing debris into our own intake pipes. The sub drifted forward in that pause, pulled by the current. When he reignited the thrusters, the hull groaned. The force required to hold position was increasing. I checked the pressure differential on our forward plates. The numbers climbed in small jumps. Each jump matched the internal pulses of the creature. The coordination was unmistakable. The commander told him to hold steady. The pilot snapped that we were losing control. His voice cracked. The commander reached over and took one of the manual stabilizer handles. Together, they fought the slow pull. I ran a vibration scan on the hull. The metal frame registered microshifts like fingers drumming across it. The pattern wasn't from water turbulence. It was transmission. Something inside the opening was sending out low-frequency waves. The pulses spread through the water and into the hull. The vibrations were soft at first, but they grew stronger in steady steps. A tool kit on the floor rattled. A loose oxygen canister rolled toward the back wall. One of the emergency helmets dropped off its hook and bounced once before settling. The sound echoed faintly in the cramped space. The pilot called out that we were losing lateral stability. I checked the readings. Our right side stabilizers were struggling against a secondary current pulling slightly downward. The movement wasn't natural. Natural currents shift with the shape of terrain. This one shifted with the shape of the creature's breath. The opening flexed again. A rolling ripple traveled across its interior. The tissue inside contracted and then expanded in slow sequence. A large pocket of silt burst out and drifted upward. Behind it, the deeper section flickered with a faint glow, a bioluminescent pulse, not constant, a single flash, then darkness again, then another flash slightly brighter. The pilot stiffened when the scanner picked up a new signature. The return wave showed something sweeping across the space behind the opening, a slow, curved motion, as if a massive internal structure moved in a circular path. The commander whispered that it looked like a sensing organ. The pilot whispered nothing at all. His breathing grew fast. The suction intensified suddenly. Not a slow rise, a sharp increase. The sub lurched forward by almost a full meter before the thrusters compensated. The hull tilted hard enough that I had to grab a ceiling strap to keep from stumbling. The floor vibrated as something outside shifted its pressure. The thrusters whined. They pushed against the current but could barely keep us in place. The lights flickered as a voltage dip ran through the cabin. The commander checked the power gauge. A strain warning flashed. The pilot disabled non-essential systems to free power for thrust. Another deep pulse spread through the water. This one hit the sub like a soft blow. It wasn't enough to damage anything but strong enough to rattle the internal beams. A metallic clang echoed from the rear compartment. The pilot shouted that the stabilizer was slipping. He adjusted the manual override with shaking hands. The sub steadied, but only barely. I watched the scanner as the arcs grew taller. The wideness of the opening increased by another few centimeters. The deeper interior shifted. The lines on the scanner pulsed faster. The biological rhythm inside the creature was accelerating. Then something thudded lightly against the hull. Not debris. Not rock. Soft, organic, a brushed contact. The commander and pilot froze at the sound. My hands tightened on the scanner console. The sub drifted another half-meter toward the opening. The pilot hit the reverse thrusters with everything left in them. The hull moaned, the sub resisted, the current tried to pull us closer. The scanner spiked in a way it hadn't before. A warning flashed across the screen. I filtered the return signal. The lines shaped themselves into a clear reading. Something inside the mouth was moving closer to the entrance. Slow, massive, intentional. The suction grew stronger. The cavity behind the opening began to widen further. And in that moment, with the sub tilting and the current pulling us in, we all understood the same thing without speaking it. The breathing we sensed earlier was not a passive motion. It was preparation. The suction eased for a moment, not enough to free us but enough to make the thrusters push more effectively. The sub jerked backward by a few centimeters before the current pulled tight again. It felt like something inside the opening had paused, not stopped, paused, as if listening, as if adjusting. That pause didn't calm me. It terrified me more. Creatures pause before reacting. Machines pause before recalibrating. The thing beneath us wasn't rock or water or shifting plates. It was something that could wait. The scanner flickered. Static rolled over the display for a second, then cleared. When the image returned, a series of sharp spikes formed along the lower edge. They weren't the arcs we had been watching earlier. These were shorter, tighter, more frequent. I enhanced the signal. The spikes aligned themselves into a repeating pattern. Then the pattern repeated again. Then again. The commander leaned close. He recognized it at the same time I did. This wasn't movement. It was a signal. A transmission of some kind. A controlled pulse coming from inside the creature. The pilot whispered that the pattern looked like communication. The commander ordered silence. His jaw tightened. His breathing slowed. He stared at the scanner without blinking. Even he couldn't dismiss what we were seeing. The spikes weren't random. They rose in sets of 3, paused, then returned in sets of 4. The pause between sets was always the same length. The voltage change inside the return wave matched each cycle. Whatever was inside the opening was generating soundless pulses that traveled through the water and into the hull. The creature was sending something outward. I switched to directional filtering. The signal sharpened. The spikes had layers. One set came from the deeper cavity. Another came from a point slightly above it. The additional layer was faint, almost swallowed by the water pressure, but it was there. 2 sources. 2 active structures. 2 signals. The captain muttered that the creature wasn't alone. I didn't correct him. I wasn't sure if the second signal meant an entirely separate organism or if it was part of the same body. A multi-chamber system. Internal organs coordinating. The suction shifted again, gentler but directed. The current guiding us wasn't random turbulence. It was shaped. It had a pattern. The sub's nose turned a few degrees toward the opening without the pilot touching anything. He fought the drift with hard counterthrust. The hull creaked. The bioluminescent flicker inside the opening returned. Not a glow like before. A pulse. A faint green wave that rippled along the inner tissue. It moved in perfect sync with the scanner spikes, light and signal rising together. The commander told me to increase magnification. I zoomed in. The faint glow exposed a new detail on the interior wall. Thin tendrils hung from the upper edge of the opening. At first they looked like loose folds of tissue, but when the pulse traveled again, the tendrils shifted, very slowly, each one moving in its own direction, reaching and retracting. They weren't just hanging structures. They were sensory filaments. Organic antennae. They reacted to vibration, light, and pressure. We watched them stretch toward the sub, sensing the heat from our thrusters and the electrical pulse of our instruments. The pilot stiffened. The commander swore under his breath again. The scanner flashed a new warning. An external interference spike hit the hull. The vibration frequency matched the tendrils. They were testing us, reading us, mapping us. The pulses they sent weren't just broadcasts, they were scanning signals. We were being analyzed. Another pulse surged from deeper inside the opening. The water pushed outward this time. The sub trembled as the current reversed direction. The suction stopped for 1 second. In that second, everything in the cabin went silent. Not quiet, silent, like the water itself had frozen in place. Then the suction returned, stronger, faster, more focused. The tendrils deepened their movement. They reached further out. Their tips glistened as the bioluminescent pulse lined their edges. They were sensing shape, pressure, warmth, life. The scanner lit with a third layer of spikes. 3 signals now. 3 sources. 3 internal systems responding at once. The commander placed a hand on the pilot's shoulder. His voice shook for the first time. He told him to prepare for immediate escape attempt. I checked the readings. The suction was climbing. The internal pressure of the cavity was rising. The signals were intensifying. The creature wasn't just awakening anymore. It was preparing to act. The suction tightened again, pulling the sub a few more centimeters toward the opening before the thrusters caught hold. The cabin lights flickered. A dull ache pressed against my ears from the pressure shift. The pilot fought the controls with shaking hands. The commander stood braced behind him, staring through the forward window as if he could force the ocean to explain itself. The bioluminescent glow reappeared inside the opening. This time it wasn't a flicker. It eased outward in slow pulses, illuminating the deeper interior layer by layer. The light wasn't bright. It moved like embers hidden under thick cloth, but it gave us something we had dreaded and needed at the same time. A glimpse into the thing we were approaching. The inner cavity wasn't empty. Broad folds of dark tissue lined the interior walls, arranged in wide, sweeping arcs. Each fold curved with a precision that made my stomach twist. They weren't random surfaces. They looked like layered chambers, each one connected to the next through narrow slits. As the glow traveled, the folds rippled slightly. Their motion wasn't fast. It was slow, controlled, rhythmic. The scanner pulsed in perfect sync with that rhythm. A low vibration spread across the hull, not a shudder, a soft hum, as if the creature was resonating with the water. Loose items in the cabin began to slide slowly across the floor. The pilot tried to angle us away, but the current kept pulling us back into alignment with the opening. It felt like the creature was guiding us without touching us. A tendril drifted into view, one of the long sensory filaments from earlier. Beneath the dim glow, it appeared almost translucent. The tip shimmered with faint color. It moved toward the sub in small, swaying arcs, not rushing, not striking, examining, mapping. It drifted within a few meters of the window. Every instinct I had screamed for distance. The pilot jerked the sub to the left. The current corrected his movement instantly, turning the nose back toward the cavity. The tendril swayed gently, following us with slow accuracy. Another filament appeared above it, then a third from deeper inside. The creature wasn't reacting out of panic. It was studying us. The commander told me to record everything. My hands were already moving. The camera feed locked onto the tendrils as they drifted closer. Tiny ripples moved through their lengths, responding to our thruster vibrations. When the scanner pulsed, the tendrils pulsed back in faint color changes. A conversation of signals. The inner folds shifted again, this time deeper inside. The motion rolled through the tissue like a long breath spreading from one chamber to the next. As the wave traveled, the bioluminescence brightened for a moment. The interior space expanded slightly. Water rushed inward. The sub lurched forward, pulled by the renewed suction. The pilot slammed the thrusters to full reverse. The hull groaned loudly. When the glow dimmed, something drifted out of the opening. A dark object, rounded, slow-moving, suspended in the current. The commander leaned forward. The pilot swore. I zoomed the camera. It wasn't debris. It wasn't stone. It wasn't organic waste. It looked like a fragment, hardened, rough around the edges but shaped, a piece of something from deeper inside the creature. The current pushed it gently toward us. The pilot tried to avoid it, but the water guided the fragment straight to the sub's retrieval zone. I activated the mechanical arm before the commander had to ask. The claw reached out, trembling from the unstable water. It grasped the object carefully and retracted it into the sealed sample container. The moment the fragment entered the chamber, the tendrils outside reacted. Every one of them stiffened for a second. The glow inside the cavity brightened. The pilot tensed. He checked the thruster readings. The suction was increasing again. Harder, faster, intentional. The creature's interior shifted once more. The inner walls flexed like a throat preparing to swallow. A deep, resonant vibration moved through the water. This one was strong enough to make the cabin floor tremble under our boots. The commander whispered the truth that none of us wanted to admit. It wasn't reacting to us anymore. It was reacting to the fragment we took. And the change in its rhythm told us something we didn't want to understand. That piece we collected wasn't from the creature's exterior. It was from deeper inside. The sample container locked with a metallic click. The moment it sealed, the scanner readings jumped. Not a small spike, a surge that rolled across the screen like a rising tide. The pattern shifted from structured pulses into sharp, escalating peaks. The creature beneath us reacted the instant the fragment was taken. The tendrils outside the opening moved in synchronized arcs, sweeping through the water like a cluster of searching limbs. The pilot pulled the sub back as far as the thrusters allowed, but the current tightened. It felt like invisible grips were pulling the water toward the cavity in a steady drag. The commander braced himself against the console and told me to scan the fragment immediately. My hands moved through the sequence without needing direction. The internal sensors lit up with dense readings. The fragment was organic but hardened, a chitin-like material reinforced with cartilage layers. It wasn't bone, it wasn't coral, it wasn't rock. The density chart showed an outer shell with a hollow network inside. Tiny tunnels branched through it like veins through stone. Each tunnel had a repeating spiral pattern. Spirals in living organisms usually follow predictable structures. These didn't match any known biology. The fragment pulsed. Not visibly, not physically. The sensors detected a faint internal vibration, a frequency that aligned with the creature's earlier signals. I zoomed deeper into the scan. The hollow tunnels inside the fragment were resonating. The vibrations bounced off the internal walls in recurring patterns. It was almost like the fragment was receiving something, or broadcasting something, or both. The commander asked if it was alive. I told him no. It wasn't living tissue, but it wasn't fully dead either. It had the biological equivalent of echo chambers built inside it, empty spaces meant for transmitting something, like a conduit. A conduit belonging to a creature so large, it used internal channels to move signals through its own body. The pilot muttered that the piece shouldn't have come loose unless something damaged it. I didn't answer. I didn't know if the fragment broke off by accident or if the creature expelled it on purpose. The tendrils outside shifted again. Their movements formed a slow spiral pattern. Their tips pointed toward the fragment, not toward us. They weren't sensing us anymore. They were sensing the piece we took. The bioluminescent glow inside the cavity brightened with each new pulse from the fragment's internal resonance. The creature was responding to the piece, as if it were part of itself. The thrusters growled as the pilot fought to pull us away. The suction still wasn't violent, but it was unrelenting. The hull creaked under the increasing strain. I checked the pressure differential. It was rising, slowly, but if it continued at this rate, we would lose lateral control within minutes. The fragment vibrated again. The sensors detected a more defined frequency this time. The pattern matched the second internal signal we had seen earlier, not the creature's primary pulse, a secondary one, a supporting system. Then something new happened. The scanner lit with a fresh pulse coming from inside the opening. This pulse wasn't like the others. It wasn't a slow breath or structural flex. It was sharp, targeted. It moved outward like a sonar blast without sound. The water around us quivered. The hull trembled. The fragment responded. Its inner spirals vibrated harder, aligning with the frequency from the creature. I watched the readings stack into each other in perfect symmetry. They matched with an accuracy that sent a cold shock through me. This wasn't random resonance. It was recognition. The creature sensed something familiar, something internal, something that belonged to it. The commander asked if the fragment could be a tooth. The pilot said maybe a scale. I told them both the truth. It wasn't a tooth, it wasn't a scale, it wasn't armor. The internal tunnels suggested something more complex, something purposeful, something like a sensory conduit or structural node, a piece of a much larger network, something that transmitted signal across the creature's body, which meant by taking it, we had disrupted that network. The suction intensified. The interior folds contracted and expanded with new urgency. The bioluminescence brightened until we could see half the cavity without the external lights. The creature was waking faster now, responding to the missing piece, calling for it. The pilot shouted that the stabilizer was slipping again. The sub tilted closer to the opening. The thrusters strained. The commander shouted orders, but the water pulled with increasing force. A low, deep vibration surged from the opening. The scanner froze for a second before the readings realigned. A third internal system activated. 3 signals. 3 biological responses. One purpose: retrieve the missing part. The tendrils began closing the distance. Not drifting. Reaching. The water shifted in a way I had never felt in any trench or rift zone. A rolling movement passed beneath us, slow but massive, like a continent sliding under another. The sub rocked from the force. The pilot tightened his grip on the controls. The commander steadied himself with one hand on the overhead rail. I checked the scanner again. The readings were rising in steady, vertical climbs. Not spikes, not tremors, sustained elevation. Something enormous was moving beneath the crust. The fracture widened further as layers of sediment peeled away and floated upward. Plumes of silt exploded into the water in heavy clouds. The lights cut through the debris, illuminating the curved shape that had started all of this. It shifted again. A ripple traveled along its surface from left to right, pushing loose rock aside. The movement was slow but powerful. The outer structure flexed like a muscle waking after a long sleep. The suction increased. The sub tilted more sharply than before. The pilot countered with full lateral thrusters. The hull groaned under the strain. Metal tremors ran across the floor. A loose wrench rolled toward the window and hit the glass. The sound echoed inside the cabin. The bioluminescent glow inside the opening brightened to a deeper green. It pulsed faster, illuminating new features deeper in the cavity. I saw wide internal ridges spiraling inward. I saw layered chambers contracting in slow motion. I saw the faint shimmer of fluids flowing through channels beneath the surface. These structures were not random growths. They were parts of a living system, coordinated, purposeful. The scanner recorded a heat spike, a strong one. A wave of warmth spread through the lower crust beneath the creature. The temperature rose faster than any geothermal vent we had ever documented. The pilot shouted that the heat could destabilize the sub's external plates. The commander told him to hold position. I monitored the readings. The heat signature grew into a wide shape that matched the outline of an immense mass buried under us. The creature was lifting itself. A thunder-like rumble traveled through the water. The hull vibrated with the soundless impact. A cascade of boulders along the ridge broke free and slid into the widening chasm. The pilot jerked the sub away from the falling debris. A large slab struck the edge of the opening and shattered into fragments. The pieces were sucked into the mouth in a rush of sediment. The creature responded with a deep internal pulse. The scanner showed three distinct waveforms, the same three signals we had detected earlier, all of them rising, all syncing together. The combined force produced a low hum that traveled through our bones. I felt it in my chest. The pilot pressed a hand against his ribs. The commander's face tightened as he leaned forward. A series of bubbles erupted from the far side of the trench, not small streams, huge pockets of gas blasting through the water. They rose in columns and scattered the surrounding fish. The bubbles carried heat. Our temperature gauge jumped again. The inner folds shifted. The cavity widened. The mouth opened further with a slow, heavy pull. Slabs of shale peeled away from the surrounding crust. The tendrils reached farther out, moving with more coordination. They were no longer sensing. They were searching, sweeping, reaching for what we had taken. The pilot yelled that the sub was slipping into the chasm. He hit the thrusters. The current pushed harder. The hull shook. The commander grabbed the manual override, and together they forced the sub to level out. Sweat rolled down the pilot's forehead. I stared at the scanner as the heat signature grew wider beneath the surface. The creature was rising, not rapidly, but with unstoppable momentum. It pushed against the rock layer like a giant heaving itself from under a mountain. The seismic plates around the trench shook, not from geological activity, from the creature's mass shifting. The commander finally gave the order he had avoided until this moment. Prepare for emergency ascent. The pilot's hands flew across the controls, the ballast tanks adjusted, the thrusters rotated. The sub groaned from the sudden shift, but the current fought every move. The opening pulsed again. The tendrils reached closer. The suction tightened like a closing grip. The scanner showed one last reading before the ascent sequence fully engaged. A new shape. A massive shadow rising beneath the creature's mouth. Another part of the body. Another system awakening. Something much larger was pulling itself free. The ascent thrusters roared to life, pushing the sub upward with everything they had left. The nose lifted, the cabin tilted back, and for a brief second we felt the relief of upward motion. But the water resisted. The current twisted its grip around the hull like a slow, deliberate hand. The ascent slowed. Then it stalled. Then the sub jerked downward by a few centimeters as if something huge beneath us had exhaled. The pilot cursed and increased thrust again. The engines whined under the pressure. The commander checked the fuel distribution and rerouted power from secondary systems to propulsion. The lights dimmed. The cabin's hum changed pitch. Every resource we had was being fed to the ascent. The pressure outside rose sharply, not from depth, from displacement. Something large was rising behind the creature's mouth. The scanner caught the edge of it. A wide, dark arc formed on the lower half of the display, bigger than anything we had scanned so far. The shape moved upward in slow increments, pushing pockets of heat and gas into the water. The thermal gauge spiked. The hull made a sound like stretching metal. The pilot shouted that the stabilizers were failing. I checked the readings. He was right. The downward pull from the creature's internal pressure was overpowering our vertical thrust. The water density around the sub was shifting, forming a gradient that sloped downward toward the opening. The creature wasn't just breathing now. It was rising. A heavy tremor rolled through the water and struck the hull with enough force to shake every loose bolt. A panel behind us rattled open and exposed wiring. The commander slammed it shut and held it with one hand while he braced his feet against the floor. Outside the window, sediment erupted upward like volcanic ash. Rocks bounced across the trench wall. A low curtain of dust drifted across the opening, obscuring the tendrils for a moment. When the haze thinned, the inner cavity glowed brighter than before. A far deeper section was visible now. A curved wall lined with layered plates. Each plate shifted like a scaled diaphragm preparing to expand. The pilot warned that the sub was tilting again. The current pulled us nose first toward the widening mouth. He hit the thrusters sideways, trying to break free of the alignment. The hull squealed as water pressure pressed against the plates. The stabilizers shook. The sub corrected, then slipped back into the same alignment the creature guided with the current. The scanner pulsed again. A loud, electronic whine filled the cabin. The reading showed a massive buildup of internal movement beneath the creature. The arc on the scanner expanded into a wide dome-shaped shadow pushing upward. Gas vents exploded along the seafloor. Thin cracks formed along the trench walls. The ocean floor wasn't shifting due to tectonics. It was shifting because something was pushing through it. The pilot slammed the ascent lever fully open. The engines labored under the load. For 2 long seconds, the sub didn't move. Then, a slight lift. Barely a meter, but enough to trigger a spark of hope. The commander told him not to stop. Then the pressure hit us from below. A deep wave of displacement. The sub lurched upward and then violently downward. The cabin's lights flickered. A toolbox slammed against the ceiling. One of the measurement tablets flew across the room and cracked against a metal bar. My chest hit the console. The pilot grunted as the harness cut into his shoulders. The downward force held us for 3 full seconds before easing. 3 seconds of pure crushing weight. When it released, the sub drifted upward a few inches. The pilot tried to seize the window of momentum. He pushed the thrusters again. The engines fought to keep that upward motion alive. But the scanner warned us first. A new pulse. A pressure sequence rising from deep below. Not the creature's mouth. Not the cavity, something deeper. Another system waking beneath it. The water around us vibrated. The hull shook. A deep, muffled thud traveled upward through the trench like a heartbeat scaled to the size of a mountain. The pilot screamed that we were losing attitude control. The hull twisted. A jolt nearly knocked the commander off his feet. I grabbed the console to hold myself upright. The scanner updated with a single, unmistakable reading. Something enormous was rising into the cavity from beneath the creature. Something that dwarfed everything we had seen so far. Something its mouth was preparing to receive or release. The current surged around us with renewed force. The ascent stalled for the final time, and the sub began sinking back toward the opening. The downward drag grew too strong to counter. The sub slipped another meter toward the widening mouth. The pilot fought the thrusters until their whine turned into a strained, uneven rattle. The commander tried to stabilize our orientation by rerouting emergency power. The cabin lights dimmed again. A low alarm began to beep in a slow, steady pattern. Not a malfunction warning, a pressure alert. The water density had shifted so drastically that our sensors were struggling to interpret the environment. Then the trench floor moved. Not a landslide. Not collapsing rock. A shape pushed upward from beneath the seafloor, lifting entire slabs of sediment like sheets of cracked ice. The pressure wave hit us seconds later. It shoved the sub backward. For one brief moment we floated free of the suction, thrown off alignment. The pilot seized the opportunity, firing the reverse thrusters with everything he had left. We rose a few meters. Not enough, but enough to see what was coming out of the earth. The curved structure we'd mistaken for cartilage expanded outward. The rock around it sheared away as if peeling from an egg. As the silt cleared, we saw the full contour of what had looked like a simple ridge. It wasn't a ridge at all. It was the top arc of a colossal head. Layer after layer of hardened plates peeled free of the silt, each one thick enough to dwarf the sub. These plates overlapped like a natural armor. When the next pulse moved through the creature, the plates shifted in a wave, revealing the faint green glow of internal bioluminescence seeping through the cracks. The pilot whispered something that didn't sound like language. The commander pressed his hand to the window. His breath fogged the glass. I kept my eyes on the scanner even as my stomach tightened. The readings weren't showing a single organism anymore. The shape expanding beneath us was too large for any biological template in the database. The arcs grew taller until they vanished off the screen's top edge. The creature's head continued to rise. A deep rumble traveled along its surface, moving through the armor-like plates. Gaps widened between them, exposing slick, dark membranes underneath. Those membranes pulsed with faint light. As they expanded, the suction pulling at us increased again. The pilot shouted that we were losing depth stability. The sub tilted, nose downward. The thrusters howled. The hull vibrated in long shivers. Then the creature opened its mouth wider. Not a snap. A slow stretch. The kind of motion that suggested scale, beyond anything we had imagined. The interior cavity glowed with shifting patterns. The tendrils reached farther, swaying like deep-sea antennae scanning the water for threats or signals. They drifted in coordinated sweeps, almost like they were communicating with each other. Their tips shimmered in pale green pulses, each pulse synchronized with the deeper internal movements. The creature's sensory systems were fully active now. Behind the glowing cavity, deeper inside the darkness we had been trying to avoid, another shape moved. A massive curved structure lifted upward. Larger than the head. Larger than the mouth. A hump-like mass rising beneath the plates. The scanner confirmed it. The creature wasn't emerging alone. It was lifting a second section of its body. Internal pressure spikes surged through the trench. The water churned. Waves of silt erupted around us. The creature's head turned slightly, angling toward the movement in the water. Toward us. The bioluminescence intensified. Rivers of light traveled across the plates, mapping the shape of the creature in faint glowing veins. It wasn't a random pattern. The light traveled in lines that curved inward toward the cavity, then back outward along the armored ridges. A communication pattern. Or a sensory activation. The pilot's voice cracked as he shouted the altitude numbers. We were still descending, slowly but steadily. The creature was rising faster than we could escape. The commander pressed a hand on my shoulder, without looking away from the window. His voice was low, flat, resigned. He told me to record everything. Because no matter what happened next, the world needed to know what existed down here. I kept recording. And below us, the creature's head rose another few meters, displacing water in long waves that shook the sub like a trapped insect. Then the creature's plates parted along a central seam and revealed something beneath them. Not bone. Not cartilage. A vast sensory pit lined with shimmering membranes. It opened like a second eye, large enough to reflect our entire sub in its surface. The sensory pit opened fully, revealing a vast, concave surface lined with shimmering membranes. The bioluminescent veins across the creature's plates funneled into this cavity in thin, glowing streams. The light gathered there, pulsing in slow waves that made the entire trench flicker with a deep green glow. For a moment the water felt warm, as if the creature's internal heat radiated outward through the sensory chamber. Then the suction changed. It shifted from a steady inward drag to a spiraling pull. The water around us twisted in a slow rotation, not violent, not fast, a controlled vortex forming with the mouth as its center. The nose of the sub tilted down sharply. The pilot slammed the reverse thrusters. The engines roared. The hull vibrated so hard the bolts in the floor rattled. But the spiral kept growing, inch by inch, pulling the water into a slow, deliberate rotation. A swirl large enough to turn the weight of the ocean. Loose debris from earlier drifts began spinning around us. Shards of rock moved in a slow orbit. Strips of plant matter coiled into thin loops. Even heavy fragments of the trench wall drifted into the rotation, circling the creature's mouth like satellites gravitating toward a planet. The pilot fought the controls with both hands, but each movement was undone by the vortex. The commander gripped the overhead rail and shouted for more power. The engine lights flashed yellow. The sub trembled under the force. The air in the cabin felt heavy. My stomach tightened from the pressure shifts. The creature pulsed again. The membranes inside the sensory pit expanded outward like a giant lung. The vortex deepened. The spiral tightened. The pull increased. The sub lurched forward despite the engines resisting with everything they had. The scanner spiked with a new wave of readings. The creature's internal pressure surged. The dome-shaped mass rising behind the head pushed upward with more force. The gas vents along the seafloor erupted again, sending columns of bubbles racing into the vortex. They spun into the spiral like white coils drawn into the central maw. The pilot yelled that we were being dragged in. The commander barked for him to hold the angle. I braced myself against the console and stared at the scanner. The entire display warped from interference. The lines bent inward, forming a bowl-shaped distortion centered on the creature's mouth. A vortex strong enough to shape readings. The sub tilted again, harder. The left stabilizer screeched as metal strained against the water's twist. The pilot steered sideways to break the alignment, but the spiral corrected our direction instantly. We slid in slow arcs toward the glowing cavity. The tendrils at the mouth's edge moved in wide sweeps now. They traced the spiral's shape as if guiding it. Their tips glowed brighter. Every time one passed the edge of the cavity, the suction intensified. Their movements weren't random. They were coordinating the vortex. The creature inhaled again, a long, heavy pull that shifted the entire environment. The water twisted harder. The sub jerked nose first toward the opening. The pilot slammed full reverse thrust. The engines pushed back with a violent shudder. For a moment we slowed. Just a moment. Then the vortex deepened again. The commander shouted for emergency ballast release. The pilot hit the override. The tanks ejected their weight with a loud thump. The sub grew lighter. It lifted a few meters against the pull. But the water rotated tighter, faster. The suction climbed. The sensory pit glowed brighter. The membranes contracted in unison. The creature prepared for the next pulse. I saw the warning on the scanner a second before it hit, a pressure wave rising from deep inside the creature. The shape of the reading was unmistakable. A full internal compression, a coordinated expansion of all three internal systems. The creature wasn't inhaling. It was preparing to draw the vortex inward. A single massive pull. The pilot screamed over the engines. The sub jerked. The hull creaked. The vortex tightened. Debris spun faster. Rocks clattered against the front window. One struck the side plate hard enough to send a metallic thud through the cabin. Then the creature released the pulse. A heavy shockwave pushed outward from its cavity. The vortex buckled, then inverted. Water surged inward in a burst of force so strong it punched the sub like a giant fist. The cabin lurched sideways. We spun. Alarms blared. The pilot lost the controls. The commander fell against the rear railing. I grabbed the console and held on as the world turned into a storm of spinning water and flickering lights. We were caught. The creature's final pull dragged us directly into its spiral. And for the first time since the dive began, the sub no longer moved because we commanded it. It moved because something colossal beneath us had decided it. The world spun in a tight, disorienting spiral. The sub twisted helplessly inside the vortex. The engine screamed under the strain. The interior lights stuttered into a frantic flicker. Every loose item in the cabin rolled, slammed, and rattled in unpredictable arcs. The metal frame groaned under forces it was never designed to endure. The pilot clung to the controls just to keep himself upright. The commander braced both feet against the wall, gripping a rail as the cabin tilted nearly sideways. Then through the spinning chaos, the trench floor broke. Not cracked. Not split. Broke. A massive section of the sea bottom collapsed downward in a violent drop. The pressure wave slammed into the sub like a collapsing building. The hull shuddered under the impact and drifted sideways in a wide, uncontrolled swing. The scanner lit with a flash of red error signals. The water filled with silt, rocks and debris bursting upward in thick clouds. The creature reacted immediately. The mouth contracted, the sensory pit dimmed. The armored plates shifted in shock. A deep pulse rolled through the trench, pushing the silt outward in a wave so strong it bent kelp into tight spirals. The vortex wavered for a moment, weakening as the environment cracked beneath the creature's body. A section of rock near the far ridge split open. A plume of boiling water erupted upward. The heat spike hit our sensors before the water even reached us. A second vent opened near it. Then a third. The thermal readings jumped into levels usually seen only near volcanic eruptions. The creature wasn't causing these eruptions. It was reacting to them. The collapse had triggered something deep within the crust, something the creature had been using as a foundation. And now that foundation was crumbling. The immense rising mass beneath the creature dropped by several meters. A heavy impact rolled through the water. The armored plates crashed together in slow overload. The mouth snapped partially shut. The tendrils whipped backward toward the cavity. The bioluminescent glow dimmed to near darkness. And for the first time since the opening appeared, the suction stopped. The pilot seized the chance. He kicked the thrusters to maximum ascent. The engines roared back to life with painful intensity. The sub jerked upward before the current dragged it sideways again. The trench floor continued to cave in. Huge slabs fell into the widening chasm. Entire ridges sank and snapped like wet plaster under immense weight. The creature reacted with a desperate, heavy shift. Its head sank deeper as the supporting terrain beneath it collapsed. A large section of armor plates slid downward into the chasm. The membranes fluttered weakly. Gas pockets burst around its body, sending violent plumes of heat and debris in all directions. The sub spun again as a pressure wave hit from below. A heavy clank echoed through the cabin as a rock fragment slammed into the starboard plate. The pilot steadied the controls, wrestled the sub upright, then forced the thrusters toward open water. The commander shouted to avoid the collapsing ridge. We drifted dangerously close to the falling debris. A chunk the size of a small vehicle tumbled past the nose and disappeared into the creature's mouth. The cavity swallowed the debris, then convulsed in what looked like a reflex. The scanner caught one final reading inside the creature. A powerful downward pressure spike. Like the creature had shifted its entire weight in a single desperate motion. The ground beneath it fell away completely. The creature dropped. Its massive body slipped deeper into the collapsed chasm, dragging layers of crust with it. Tremors spread across the trench like ripples across a pond. The collapse deepened, widening the hole until the creature's head vanished into the abyss it accidentally created. The suction disappeared entirely. The vortex died. The water calmed in a sudden, eerie stillness. The pilot didn't hesitate. He thrust the sub straight upward, taking advantage of the rare moment of neutral pressure. The cabin rattled. The stabilizers struggled, but we rose with real momentum for the first time since the dive began. The commander watched the scanner as the creature's readings faded deeper and deeper below us. Not disappearing, just sinking beyond detection range. The chasm continued to expand and collapse behind it, sealing parts of the opening, burying sections of the creature's body under new layers of shifting earth. Before the scanner lost it completely, we saw one last pulse. A slow, faint signal rising from deep beneath the freshly collapsed terrain. Weak, but deliberate. The creature wasn't dead. It was retreating. The pilot pulled us higher, leaving the broken trench far below. The water above us felt different the moment we broke free from the pull. The currents weren't fighting anymore. The pressure wasn't twisting around the hull. The engines didn't sound like they were screaming for survival. For the first time since the dive began, the sub moved the way it was designed to move, straight upward. clean ascent, no resistance except the natural weight of the ocean. But the silence was wrong. The ocean should never be this quiet, not at this depth, not after seismic collapse, not after something that size had shifted under the seafloor. There should have been echoes, rumbling, residual pressure waves. Instead, everything felt suspended, still, expectant, as if the water was holding its breath. The pilot kept the ascent thrusters at maximum safe power. The engines hummed in a steady rhythm. The commander checked every gauge twice. Oxygen levels, seal integrity, interior pressure, power reserves. Each system flickered under stress but held. Lines of sweat dried on our faces as the cabin cooled from the loss of emergency power loads. I checked the scanner. Fatting residue pulses trailed below us like echoes of a seismic heartbeat. Weak, sporadic, drifting deeper into the new chasm. Every few seconds, the faint outline of the creature's mass flickered at the bottom of the readings before slipping completely beyond range. It wasn't gone. It was just too deep for us to track. The commander asked if the creature had stopped moving. I told him the truth. It hadn't. It was still shifting, slowly, rhythmically, alive, but sinking into a space we couldn't reach. The collapse had created a new cavern, a deeper one with walls still reshaping themselves from the seismic damage. A temporary prison. Or a shelter. We didn't know which. The ascent continued. 1,000 meters passed. Then 1,200. Then 1,500. The water slowly lightened from total black to faint dark blue. The pressure eased in tiny increments. Each increment made the sub creak less. The metal felt less strained. The floor vibrated less under our boots. The pilot finally breathed without shaking. But the silence deepened. No wails. No distant currents. No shifting gravel. Nothing. It was the quiet you hear after a disaster. An ocean holding still after being forced to witness something it couldn't contain. Around 1,800 meters, the forward window began to frost at the edges as we entered a colder layer. The lights cut through drifting particles that looked like underwater dust. Fine, white, suspended. They spiraled around the sub in slow motion. Ash from the collapse. Sediment. Micro-debris from rock pulverized under immense weight. It floated upward like snow. The commander leaned beside me and stared at the scanner. His voice dropped when he asked if the signals were completely gone. I shook my head. A faint pulse still flickered every few minutes, weak but organized. Creatures don't send organized pulses during death. The pilot kept pushing upward. Another few hundred meters passed. The water grew lighter. The temperature rose again. The tension in the cabin eased until the silence became the only thing left pressing against us. The scanner flickered once, a small blip from deep below, a final remnant of the creature's internal systems adjusting to its new depth. Then it vanished completely. The signal didn't fade. It cut, like something large had settled into position. Like something had stopped moving because it no longer needed to move. The commander let out a slow breath. The pilot whispered a thank you that didn't sound directed at anyone in particular. I stared at the scanner long after the signal dropped. My mind replayed the pulses, the symmetry, the patterns stacking into each other. The moment the fragment reacted, the moment the creature responded as if it recognized something missing. We weren't leaving a dead thing behind. We were leaving a life that had surfaced just enough to show itself, then retreated before waking fully. The ascent continued until a faint shimmer appeared above us. A thin sheet of surface light filtered through the last 20 meters. The pilot throttled down. The engines relaxed. The commander steadied his breathing. We rose slowly into the brightness, leaving the abyss behind. But the silence followed us. And in that silence, I understood something with complete certainty. The creature wasn't trapped. It wasn't dying. It wasn't defeated by the collapse. It was simply waiting for the ocean to settle again. The sub broke through the surface with a violent splash that felt too loud after the silence below. Sunlight hit the windows in sharp beams. The hull bobbed in the waves, groaning from the climb. The shift from crushing darkness to open air should have brought relief, but the tension inside the cabin didn't lift. It only changed shape. The pilot powered down the engines. The hum faded into a dull ringing in my ears. The commander unbuckled his harness slowly, as if every movement risked breaking whatever thin thread kept him steady. I wiped condensation from the scanner screen and checked one last time for any trace of a returning pulse. Nothing. Just the calm ocean and the static hiss of normal surface interference. The recovery crew on the ship spotted us immediately. Their voices echoed from above, urgent and confused. The sub was hoisted out of the water by the crane, its metal plates smeared with silt and streaked by deep scratches from debris. Deckhands swarmed around us the second the hatch unlocked. Hands pulled us up one by one. The sunlight felt unreal on my face after so long in the deep. The commander stumbled when he stepped out, not from injury, from the sudden release of tension. The pilot blinked against the brightness like he hadn't seen daylight in years. A medical team rushed over. They checked our vitals, asked rapid questions, flashed lights in our eyes. Their voices felt distant, muffled, unreal. My answers came out slow, like my mind was still 5,000 meters below trying to interpret pulses that no human should ever see. The ship captain approached with a grim expression. He asked for our initial report. The commander said we'd give a full briefing once we stabilized. The captain nodded, but his eyes drifted to the sub's damaged hull. He already knew something had gone wrong, something big enough to warp metal and empty the expressions from our faces. Then the officials arrived. Not our research team. Not the usual support crew. People in unmarked jackets. People who moved with purpose. People who didn't waste time introducing themselves. They demanded access to the recordings, the samples, the logs. The commander tried to object, but the captain stepped between them. The exchange was short and tense. The officials spoke quietly, but not kindly. The fragment we retrieved was sealed into a reinforced container and taken away before we could analyze it further. One of the officials pulled the commander aside. Their conversation was brief. The commander's jaw tightened the longer the man spoke. When the official walked away, the commander stared at the ocean for a long moment with a look that didn't belong to a man who'd survived a near-death dive. It belonged to someone who had just realized he wasn't allowed to tell the truth about it. Crew members approached us one by one, offering water and blankets. Their questions came in cautious whispers. They wanted to know if we had encountered a vent eruption, a structural collapse, a deep-sea quake. We didn't answer, not because we wanted to stay silent, but because our voices wouldn't come out. Every explanation felt too small. The ship's intercom eventually crackled with a public statement. Unusual seismic activity affected the expedition. Damage occurred. The team is safe. That was all. A lie wrapped in a soft blanket of truth. The ocean under us was calm now, beautiful, ordinary. The waves rolled in slow, harmless rhythms. Seagulls circled overhead. The world looked normal enough that anyone else would believe nothing unusual had happened. But the pressure under my ribs didn't ease. The silence in my head wasn't fading. And somewhere deep below us, the trench was still shifting. Not seismically. Deliberately. The pilot sat beside me on the deck. He stared at the water with an expression that didn't blink. He asked me if I thought the collapse killed it. I told him I didn't believe that for a second. The commander overheard and didn't argue. Because each of us felt the same thing we couldn't explain. The signals didn't fade. They stopped. Like something massive had settled into a new position. Waiting. Breathing. Alive. And deep inside the newly formed chasm, the ocean still pulsed in faint rhythms that didn't belong to tides or currents. Something was still moving under us. Something that knew we took a piece of it. Something that wasn't done. The briefing room onshore felt too small for what we had brought back. The walls buzzed with the low hum of fluorescent lights. The air smelled like salt, metal, and antiseptic. I sat at the center table with the commander and pilot on either side. A team of analysts crowded around us with clipboards, tablets, and questions that didn't match the scale of what we witnessed. They asked about our depth, our descent speed, our thruster failures, our pressure anomalies, all the technical details that looked impressive on paper but meant nothing compared to the truth buried beneath the ocean floor. The commander answered calmly. The pilot spoke in clipped sentences. I stayed quiet as long as I could. Every time I opened my mouth, I felt the weight of the creature pressing against my ribs like it had followed me to the surface. When they finally left us alone, I walked to the back room where our equipment had been stored. My recorder sat on the table, still running on low battery. The last seismic logs were saved automatically. I plugged it into the review station and waited for the files to load. The first few minutes showed static, then weak traces of residual pulses from the collapse. Then nothing. Normal. Expected. Safe. I almost shut it off until a new waveform appeared. A clean spike. Then another. Then a cluster. Not from the dive. Not from the trench. But from hours after we resurfaced. I leaned closer. The waveform repeated. 3 pulses. A pause. 4 pulses. A longer pause. A pattern. I checked the timestamp. It wasn't from our sub. It wasn't from our equipment. It wasn't from the ship. The signal came from the global seismic feed. Sensors across the world had picked it up. I opened the full network log. Stations from the Atlantic, Indian, and Pacific Oceans displayed the same sequence. Weak at first, then sharper, then synchronized. The exact shape of the creature's internal pulses. The pilot approached behind me. His breath caught when he saw the repeating pattern. The commander stepped in slowly and stared at the screen without speaking. The signal strengthened over the next hour. More stations lit up. More readings aligned. The pattern became clearer. The intervals grew sharper. The timing more precise. This wasn't leftover seismic activity from the trench. This was communication across distances the human mind wasn't designed to measure. The screen updated again. The waveforms rose and curved into a long arc. Then another above it. The same 3 arcs we saw beneath the seafloor. The same breathing rhythm. The same internal shift. The same unmistakable signature of a living structure changing position. The pilot whispered the question we all had in our heads. If it's sending this across the whole planet, what is it trying to reach? I didn't answer. The commander leaned on the table and stared at the arcs with empty eyes. He didn't speak either. The next pulse came stronger. The waves aligned into a single, unmistakable shape. A long curve. A downward dip. A widening center. A mouth. Opening. Across the entire global seismic network. A pattern big enough for the planet to feel. The room felt smaller with every second the signal repeated. Because this wasn't the trench calling out. This was something beneath the whole ocean. Something answering. Something vast enough that our dive hadn't discovered it. We'd only discovered one part. One piece. One mouth. And now the world was hearing the rest of it. The screen pulsed again. Clean. Sharp. Deliberate. Not a warning. A beginning,